Hey guys, I partnered up with Gamers Class to do a review of the iNSaNiA support course that they just released. I want to make sure you guys know that with the promo code BSJ50, you can sign up for 50% off the first 2 months that you guys sign up for Gamers Class. So definitely check that out. And there's going to be a link in the description of the video that you guys can find the course for iNSaNiA, as well as making sure that you get the discount code when you sign up. So make sure you guys check it out. And I'm going to go ahead and talk to you guys today about exactly what I thought of the course. We're going to give you some sneak peeks about what is in the course and just overall my impressions and what I learned myself. So hopefully you guys maybe want to check it out and learn a lot from iNSaNiA too.
Banana slam jam.
So as you guys see here, the whole course has a bunch of stuff in it. There's 19 total videos. Some of them are as long as 20 minutes. It's about 3 hours and 21 minutes of material. And he talks about different stages of the game and really conceptualizing what it means to be a position 5, approaches you can take to really break down the game, to understanding how other roles tie into your role as a position 5. And one of the first things that I really noticed was him talking about how position 5's items, play style, warding is all about enabling your team's game plan. So a lot of position 5 is about understanding other roles. And he not only tells you that, but he also does a great job of breaking down how you can learn these types of things and also maybe how you can take certain steps towards learning one other role at a time and how different supports you play will pair well with specific roles, which means that if you're playing more gank-oriented supports, maybe you can learn to play mid-heroes and how they tie into that because they're the more active heroes. If you're playing the more defensive, safe supports, you can more so focus on how to enable your carries and maybe playing a few carry games in the popular carries of that patch. So we're going to go ahead and get into a few of these videos and break down exactly some key points I got from them and exactly why I thought the course was so good. So once we get past the intros, we start with the laning. And he talks about exactly definition of a 5, not only in the lane, but in the game. And he's really just focusing on if you can have the creativity to have impact without items, that the 5 position can be the role for that hero. So when we break down the laning, he simplifies it into 3 categories. He talks about kill threat, sustain, and harassment. And he talks about how certain supports timings line or he talks about enabling the lane by having these supports that line up with the timings of their carry. So a perfect example that he gave was Undying and Morphling, where Morphling as a carry is really weak until 2 points in attribute shift, which is level 3, while a hero like Undying is really strong until level 3, where his first point in decay as well as soul rip can be really scary abilities. So if you have supports that cover the weakness of their cores, then that's usually a much better duo. And if you have supports that are really strong early game, making sure that you play in the lane when you're strong and playing away from the lane when you're weak. And if you're worried about cores that don't want to pick around your support, ask them before the game maybe what they're considering playing. And rather than telling them, I need this from you, figure out maybe what they want to do first. And he said that that's a much more likely way to synergize with your teammates, as you can't always rely on them to pick around the hero that you've already picked, since supports often pick early on in the draft. So in this verse example I want to pull from iNSaNiA's course, he talks about what exactly are you going to be content with in the lane? And so let me go ahead and play it out for you, and we're going to discuss exactly how I interpreted this.
If we go evenly out of this lane, if my Terrorblade has free farm and this Mars is free farm, I'm very satisfied. That means the name of the game for me is pulls.
When he goes into a lane, he thinks to himself, do we want to dominate the lane? Am I trying to secure trading of farm? And once he's answered that question, he's now decided how much he wants to play in lane. And if he's going for farm, that means he wants to give as much solo experience to his carry as possible. And he wants the opponent 4 to be dragged away from his carry, which means he's playing for farm. So all the lanes that he envisions playing for even or just trading farm, that's when he plays for pulls, and how incorporating other components of the lane means less interaction with enemy heroes and more overall efficiency. And the key that he kept emphasizing throughout the entirety of his course is this is something he envisioned during the lane itself. And he said, if you don't really know, this is the kind of stuff that you can learn over time. And just making a guess is what I've always encouraged about decisions like this, is the only way you're going to get better. So as a support, really having a plan going into the lane of what you plan to get out of it is a very important first step. Every game you go into, when you construct this game plan, he emphasizes trust yourself with what you know. trust your gut, but then afterwards be willing to reflect on maybe was that the best way to get done what I wanted? Maybe we weren't supposed to trade farm in this lane. Maybe we were supposed to be more aggressive. But this is the kind of stuff that you question after the game. If it's already happened, let it go. Move on to the next best thing that you can do. He always says to focus on the current situation, not the hypotheticals of how you thought things were going to go. So if you don't feel useful in lane, a lot of supports will feel bad. Maybe they messed up the lane. Maybe their carry is suffering and they feel like they have to be glued to their carry. But he said the complete opposite, where if you're feeling powerless in lane, GTFO, look to stack camps, look to plan for after the lane, because the longer you stick with your carry, the more experience you're sapping from them, and also the more attention you are drawing to them. A small tidbit that I had never considered before is that if you're a support that wants to play aggressive based on what you think should happen in the lane, that buying salves and regen for your cores, such as tangos, and just feeding them to them, promote them to be aggressive. I realized right after he said that as a carry player, if I see my support does not have a salve, I myself am fearful of committing into an engagement, because what if I take 500 damage and then I have no way to reset and sustain the lane afterwards? So definitely considering what items you're willing to give to your carry and enabling them to help you is something you should consider if you do want to play the lane and you do want to be aggressive. As I mentioned at the start of the video, iNSaNiA broke down this course into multiple stages. And after he talks about getting out of the lane, he says what you're going to do coming out of the lane. And he first off emphasized that you want to be monitoring how the lanes are going as often as possible. Is my mid laner winning? Will he have momentum? Is my off laner getting completely sacrificed? Is there anything I can do to enable him? And these are things that he's planning during the laning phase, such that his wards coming out of the laning phase, as well as his movements, will be best catered to the current situation in the game. He emphasized time and time again throughout this course the importance of supports being able to adjust to what's already happened in the game, because there's just so many iterations of what can occur based on individual misplays or outplays that will affect the pace and the ability of heroes to execute in the game. So we're going to watch a quick clip of what iNSaNiA does when he's thinking about his first move out of the laning phase.
So this is something that you really want to think about when you're trying to get out of your lanes, is like, what other timings are my teammates hitting on the map, and how do I use those timings to create impact for myself and for my team and progress the game further in the right direction.
So in the example he had just shown, he was talking about rotating to his DK who had just hit level 6. And this not only draws attention to your strong heroes and makes the opponent have to fight against them, but it also draws attention away from your weak heroes. And he talks about distributing his resources as a support because he is strong based on the heroes that he's playing around. So really playing away from your weak heroes and enabling the strong heroes on the map. One of his key emphasis, because he knows a lot of the struggle that the supports go through in pub matches, is that if you're drawing attention away from your carry who's trying to farm by either rotating to your off lane or to your mid, and your carry dies, your job was to communicate that you were leaving, and if your carry dies, that is not your fault, and despite that, you should be happy with the fact that you calculated your move and not worrying about the repercussions of your teammates being upset if they misplay. Just try to recognize objectively if it was your fault if something happened, and if it wasn't, focus on your own mistakes rather than what other people did in response to things you did, because that will prevent you from doing the right thing just because you're scared of repercussions from your teammates. When you're not 100% sure what to do, iNSaNiA emphasizes warding and stacking camps and making sure that you hit those timings on the minute, and any time between then you can look to sit behind one of your cores, because oftentimes when you don't have plays, the opponent's going to be looking to make plays. And the best part about stacking is oftentimes as support you want to take over one of your core's lanes for XP. So if your cores don't want to leave their lane, you can bait them into doing the right thing by stacking for them. Imagine telling your core, hey, there's 4 camps over here that you can farm all stacked, and in the meantime, they're going to be much more willing to let you take their lane. I really liked how he mentioned baiting your teammates into letting you have their lane, because it's actually the best thing to do. He also mentions dealing with heroes that you can't make plays against, such as like a super tanky Tidehunter, which he uses as an example, but I also think of Timbersaw as the archetype of this type of hero that you cannot kill early game. If these are the type of heroes you're stuck dealing with, it's really good to try to force them away from where they currently are playing, such that if you force them to TP, say from bottom to top, that means that they're no longer bottom and your carry should be able to farm there safely. So it's all about drawing those heroes away from where they want to play, which will enable your team to be strong. It's not about killing them. The second you force them to react, just back off. Every decision he makes as a 5, he talks about, what would my carry want me to do? What does my playmaking mid, where does he want to go? What about my offlaner? What is his timing? Every decision he made, he referenced the cores that he was playing around and what types of heroes they are. Are we content farming, or do we want to look to shut down the farm of the opponent? Later on in video 11, he actually mentions, when he talks about identifying win conditions, that for you to truly understand the win conditions of your team, you can look to play other roles. He says that it's important if you understand how Shadow Fiend Yule's timing works, or the Battle Fury timing for an anti-mage and how that affects his farming patterns. If you understand this type of stuff, it'll make you a much better support player because you know what your wards and movements are meant to accomplish.
You just have to think about what's the most valuable play here. Like, let's say I illuminate, blast this OD top. Is that more value than 2 stacked camps? Probably not, right?
His emphasis was every time he's deciding between reasonable plays of occupying the lane or looking to play efficiency game in the jungle, he's simply asking himself, if I were to be in lane doing what I would be doing, which is blasting the opponent OD, is that more helpful to the Bristle than giving him the extra farm later? He talks about how the harder it is to contest the lane, or the earlier that one of your teammates can clear stacks, are going to be clear ways to gauge whether or not you're supposed to play predominantly in the lane helping your core or away from lane. So with heroes like Anti-Mage that can't really farm stacks, enabling them to play the lane longer is usually the better call. While when you're dealing with heroes like Bristle that are very level-centric and able to clear stacks, Bristle, Sven, that means that you can look to play more outside of lane, because even if they're getting less creeps in lane, it means they'll get overall more farm later, and once they leave for that farm, all the experience you've sacrificed by not being in lane will be given back to you by getting that lane by yourself. Kind of tying to what he said earlier of baiting your teammates into doing the right thing. The way he thought about timings, which I thought was really cool, was that he identified what his next timing was. Was that your mid laner with a blink? Are we waiting for your carry to get 2 items? And whatever that was, he was trying to make that happen as soon as possible. So he would have a heavy emphasis on stacking if it's for the carry and their efficiency, or his stacking location would be determined on the hero that he wants to get it. So there was an example where his mid lane Tiny, he knew that once the Tiny got blinked, they'd be able to change the pace of the game. So he emphasized stacking camps around the mid lane, but then his carry was an anti-mage who could not farm stacks, and since his carry couldn't really farm stacks, he wasn't as much concerned about his carry in terms of stacking later. He no longer stacked camps anymore. He only stacked to make the timing of the Tiny as soon as possible to change the game plan. He's looking at the moment in the game when he's going to change the pace and the status quo. One thing I loved about video 11, the identifying win conditions, is that he took specific example drafts and just ran through his entire thought process of how each 3 cores play the map and how that's going to tie into their timings and how they're going to execute the same thing. He says in games that you're going to be securing lanes, taking early towers, taking Roche, and then going high ground. And these are steps that are going to occur every single game. So all it really comes down to is how your team factors in there, when they're going to be able to do it, and how they're going to go about doing it. Are they going to kill heroes first? Are they going to smoke and just set up area control with heroes like Venomancer or Beastmaster? The methods for what they're doing is all that differs, not what they're actually doing, because the game plan for a game of Dota is pretty much always the same. So when we moved on to team fighting, he talked about how, remember that role distribution 1 through 5 is talking about how much farm and priority heroes are getting when nothing's going on. And he wants you to conceptualize dropping that as soon as team fights are happening. That oftentimes supports are some of the most important heroes, and they are at least as important in team fights as the cores are. So don't think of yourself as a sacrifice. Don't think that your life doesn't matter. Most of the golden experience that supports get from fights, including being willing to buy back to get these things, is from team fights as opposed to being on the map. So put a lot more value on yourself during team fights because you are just as important as your cores. One common mistake that he touched on that he thinks a lot of support players make is that they base their positioning on the opponent, when he thinks a lot of it is actually positioned based on your teammates. If you're a support that needs to be protected in the backlines, oftentimes he wants to put himself next to the hero on his team that's the highest threat, because that means that if the enemy core goes on him, that his hero will be able to kill the enemy core at least immediately after, and at that point he's sacrificing himself for his core to do damage, which means he's effectively having impact. The worst thing you can do is allow yourself to create a 1v1 with an enemy carry or mid, such that as a support, obviously you're going to lose that, and you're effectively useless in the fight. When he's playing safe supports or heavy teamfight supports, he talked about think of the threat of your ultimate, not just the ability usage itself. If you're thinking that the opponent will not go on your ally because you're an Oracle, which is the example he used, and you haven't used your ultimate yet, that being very patient and holding on to that, I've seen time and time again where people in Twitch chat watching professional Dota or just a stream talk about like passive Yules or passive ultimate. And a lot of times at the highest level, things that you can consider, no matter what level you're at, but the things that these players do consider is that if I don't use this ability, what does that prevent the opponent from doing? And if it's preventing them from using their own ability, which may be stronger, or preventing them from initiating at all, that could be even more impactful than the casting of the ability itself. So one thing I really liked about his course was that he kept tying back like current lessons to his old lessons and kind of segueing really well from one subject to another. So like in this example, he went from team fighting to warding, and he talked about how if a team is willing to fight, it's usually based on if they have ward vision around there. So every fight he's going into, or like every tower that he's looking to siege, he asks himself, what would the opponent's willingness to take the fight there be? And oftentimes that will be dictated by their vision. And that vision basically decides fights at all stages of the game. So as support, it's good to be very aware when it comes to choosing team fights where your vision on the map is, and also having a gauge of whether or not the opponent would have vision based on their reaction to the movements that you are making. So when he moves into the warding section, he actually does a really good job of breaking down exactly how he envisions what wards do for your team. So he talks about how you want to have a vision of, he talks about how he thinks to himself where his teammates would want to farm, how much area of the map he thinks they should control based on whether or not they're winning or losing. And his wards won't focus on covering the most area. He doesn't look to have the biggest circle be highlighted. He thinks of the areas he wants to farm and then covering them with, he thinks of the areas he wants to farm, and then he thinks of the entrances to those areas because he thinks that's the most efficient way for wards to cover the map. So for instance, he shows covering his triangle, the 2 ramps, he would place a ward that would see both ramps, and then he gauges based on how many ramps and objectives the ward sees as its likelihood to get dewarded. So he considers the more the vision provides, the greedier the ward is. So then you can also gauge how greedy can I be, how likely it is that the opponent's going to deward this. And you can kind of base that off of your MMR level, and also based on like if you think the opponent's going to be able to invade an area. So at a super advanced level, something I had never thought of, he thought to himself, or he talked about how the opponent's going to invade certain areas in a different way. He thinks that certain areas of the map are likely to be smoked to, and other areas are likely to just be walked at by the opponent, like sieging an objective. So when he talks about the triangle, he talks about that's a place that the opponent often smokes to. So sometimes it's not the best idea to have wards on your own triangle, because those can almost be a bait that make your carry feel safe. He'll often try to place wards where the opponent would smoke from. So he considers what hero will be in the smoke. Will it be the enemy mid or the enemy offlaner? And then he thinks where would the supports meet to smoke to the triangle. So that's when he places wards behind enemy towers. He'll smoke into their jungle if he's worried about not being able to do that safely. And he thinks of the start of the smoke rather than the end of it. And then if it's the other portion of the map, say he thinks the opponent will smoke into his triangle, but maybe they'll look to push tier 1 bottom if he's Radiant, he's going to place the wards covering the triangle in the smoke areas on the other side of the map, and he's going to place the wards in the bottom half directly in front of his tower. So I thought that was a really crazy distinction. That was like something I had never thought of, and I'll definitely be able to use in my games. In this next example, iNSaNiA talks about what one ward will do and how he exactly conceptualizes like when he places that ward, what it's meant to accomplish.
Nice to spot out the enemy team's mid hero if he wants to try to teleport in and gank someone. Or if the enemy team position 4 player is trying to rotate out towards the mid lane, because you'll spot him running in the river here, while simultaneously giving you vision of anyone trying to pull this hard camp.
So in that case, he talked about the enemy mid, or the enemy 4 ganking your mid laner, the enemy mid teeping into your safe lane in order to gank you, and he also talks about the potential of the 4 position pulling the hard camp. So it's not about seeing these specific things, but seeing the route at which people would take to do these things. So if he sees the 4 walking through the river, if he sees the enemy mid teeping into the tower, or he sees the 4 walking over to the hard camp, he can infer what they're going to be doing by them crossing that area. And that's just such an efficient way to use one ward to accomplish 3 different objectives. And that's how he views his own warding. So on the flip side, he conceptualizes dewarding. And he says that to do this, to deward properly, you'd think what areas on the map you want to invade and what paths the opponent would likely ward in order to prevent you from doing so. And also thinking of where the opponent would want to invade you and protecting that area by dewarding it. So he would talk about the paths he'd want to take to get certain objectives. And along those paths, since he's assuming the opponent's warding properly, if they're not, that's perfectly fine, that he's going to ward along his or deward along his path just to make sure that his movement is successful in case he's rotating to mid, in case he's invading the opponent's farm, no matter what he's trying to accomplish. So in the final videos, he talks about the mentality that it takes to improve as support, and he emphasizes something I've always talked about as a coach, which is breaking down little components of the game that you want to work on. And if you focus on one thing at a time, that you're much more likely to improve, because if you go into a game hoping to learn a bunch of different things, you're likely going to be kind of panicking. You're going to likely be hyper focused on so many different things that you won't get any of them done. So we see here in the final one of his final videos on mentality, iNSaNiA talks about what he likes to advise his, what he advises other support players to do, and also what he attempts to do when he's getting better at Dota.
To improve at any of the positions in Dota, I'd say, is just start at the laning phase and try to figure out what you could be doing better in the lanes. And once you've gotten your laning phase figured out, you can start moving over to the next steps.
He really wraps up the course with talking about playing pubs to learn, not playing to win. I myself, if you've watched my stream a lot recently, have talked about, making sure you try to control the things that are within your control, and that's how you can enjoy the game of Dota a lot more. And I thought the sentiment that he expressed at the end was pretty much the same concept, and I just really appreciated that he included this in here. I think it's even more important for supports because you oftentimes are kind of at the mercy of your cores. Your job is to enable them to play the game, but if they don't play the game according to the vision you've placed or the smokes you've organized, then that's something that you have to accept. And he said that he focuses on trying to get better in terms of if a play goes wrong, he asked, was there something he could have done better? And if he focuses on anything his teammates are doing, it just doesn't help him reflect on his own improvement process. He doesn't go into the day thinking, I'm 9,000 MMR, I want to be 9,100 at the end of the day. He goes into the day thinking, I want to get better at my laning stage pulling, and then focuses on that purely. And as long as he comes out of the day thinking that he gained some concrete knowledge of that subject, he feels a lot more rewarded. He says it keeps his sanity in check. And it really is the best way for you to enjoy the game of Dota, regardless of your teammates. Oh, and finally, he actually talked about how getting better at Dota, you want to focus on a concept first. So whether or not that's pulling, ganking, warding, team fighting, and you should focus on a limited hero pool that you are really comfortable with. And if you want to have a more comprehensive view of that subject, expanding upon other heroes to be able to do it, because defensive supports play team fights incredibly differently than aggressive supports. And so he said that if you want to approach team fighting better, that sticking to a specific playstyle, which means usually sticking to a specific hero, will further the process and it'll allow you to feel like, okay, I've learned this, now expand and move on to something else. He talked about compartmentalizing. He never said that word specifically, but I really think that whenever I hear high-level Dota players talk about Dota, everything seems so simple. And the way he broke things down, it seemed really obvious, but it's things that I've never thought about it that specific way. And that's what I appreciate about courses like this so much. I think iNSaNiA did a great job of trying to simplify complex concepts, but he also took time to kind of dive into the advanced mechanics of a lot of things. He talked about specific ways, like hacks you can do in lane to have a sick pull sequence. He talked about how he played specific team fights, and he used a lot of examples in the process. So this whole video, this whole review, I kind of talked about the concepts he broke down, but if you guys really want to get everything you can out of this course, I highly encourage you to watch it because he breaks down several examples of every different concept and how you can maybe even learn more about specific heroes that he uses as examples, as he does include a wide array of not only carries but also offlaners and mids, and even how your fort position can play into your game plan. So I hope you guys enjoyed this little course review. Make sure you check out iNSaNiA's support course. Just came out last week. He talks about things that tie into the patch, but he also talks about generalizing things to make sure you understand the why and not just things that are going to help you in the current. So definitely check this out, and I appreciate you guys tuning in for the review.